While the PowerPoint is sorted out, let me just briefly introduce our speakers. There are longer bios in your booklet, and so there's no point in me spending the time. But we have Professor Scott Sagan from Stanford University, the Department of Political Science and the Center for International Security and Cooperation, one of the leading scholars in the United States on various nuclear policy issues. We have Dr. Francesca Giovannini, who's the Executive Director of the Committee on International Security Studies at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, where, among other things, she's been instrumental in running a program called the Global Nuclear Future. And we have Professor Bong-Geun, who is from the Korean National Diplomatic Academy, where he works on unification issues, nuclear security, the North Korea threat, and a lot of other relevant issues. The speakers in this, and I think in all of the panels, have been asked not to speak for more than 15 minutes. So one of my major chores is to make sure that people keep to time. And without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Scott Sagan, who's going to talk about the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea triangle.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a real honor to be here and to see so many friends of long-standing and colleagues and so many students here as well. I'm going to be speaking off of a paper that I've just finished called The Korean Missile Crisis. And the beginning thought is that many pundits, politicians, and scholars have said that we are facing today a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion on the Korean Peninsula. I think that's a misleading metaphor. The current crisis is not like the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's much worse in four particular ways. First, in October 1962, Fidel Castro and the Cubans did not have nuclear weapons. Castro, we now know, advocated for an immediate launch of all nuclear weapons owned by the Soviet Union, I underscore the Soviet Union, toward the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, saying, quotes, to eliminate such danger, that is the United States, forever through an act of clear legitimate defense, however harsh and terrible the solution would be. When Nikita Khrushchev got that message, he, according to his son, said, this is insane. He wants to drag us into the grave with him. Today, Kim Jong-un already possesses enough fissile material for an estimated 20 to 25 nuclear weapons. And while there is still some uncertainty about whether North Korea could successfully mount nuclear warheads on an ICBM capable of hitting the continental United States, history should caution us against making wishful thinking best-case assumptions. North Korea also has the capability to attack U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan. And if you just look this up, you'll realize that there are 150,000 Americans living in South Korea on a day-to-day basis. Even without the intercontinental capability, North Korea has for a long time had an ability to strike the equivalent of a major American city, as well as our forces and allies. The second difference between now and 1962 is that while both John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev wanted to avoid a nuclear war, the nuclear war plans of both countries were preemptive in nature, and that created a reciprocal fear of surprise attack in Thomas Schelling's, the Nobel laureate's famous terms. Today we have an even more complicated situation where North Korea, the Republic of Korea in the South, and the United States all have preemptive war plans, creating a three-way reciprocal fear of surprise attack. The growing risk of an accident, a false warning, or a misperceived military exercise leading to war is strong and growing, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Third difference between now and October 1962 is that in 1962 we had one extremely volatile autocratic leader, Fidel Castro, who surrounded himself with yes-men, told him only what he wanted to hear, and who had radical misunderstandings of the effects of nuclear weapons. Today, we have two such volatile and poorly informed leaders, Kim Jong-un and Donald J. Trump. Both have made rash statements about nuclear weapons, and both appear prone to lash out impulsively at perceived enemies. Kim clearly broaches no disagreement with his opinions and reportedly has even executed family members and rivals for being insufficiently enthusiastic in their praise. Now, Donald Trump's autocratic instincts are not comparable to Kim Jong-un's extremes, of course. But anyone who has studied dysfunctional decision-making in a dictatorship cringed when watching the U.S. Department secretaries compete in offering obsequious praise to the president in Trump's first cabinet meeting. Trump has repeatedly indicated that he distrusts official U.S. intelligence estimates, and one should also feel deeply worried when Trump described National Security Advisor Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster as a pain for correcting the president when he makes inaccurate statements in meetings. The danger of war through misperception and miscalculation is magnified in such bizarre conditions. And lastly, in 1962, strong civilian leaders were absolutely necessary to counter the dangerous hawkish instincts of the U.S. military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended an airstrike, an invasion of Cuba. They did so based on the utterly inaccurate estimate that the Soviet Union did not have nuclear warheads already in Cuba. And we should all be really thankful that President Kennedy insisted on a blockade, called the quarantine for legal reasons, and not the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommendation. Today, however, it's the senior political leadership in the United States that's making dangerous statements. Donald Trump said, "I don't like to talk about what I've planned, but we have some pretty severe things that we're thinking about." Rex Tillerson, Nikki Haley, and Vice President Pence have all said all options are on the table. And as Pence put it, we hope to achieve this objective of the denuclearized Korean Peninsula through peaceful means, but all options are on the table. Now, what does it mean when somebody says all options are on the table? For many, it just means that there are some military options being considered. But for Kim Jong-un, it suggests the United States is contemplating a preventive nuclear attack. That should not be considered a crazy view, because after all, the United States has repeatedly, in other conditions, said all options are on the table when needing to hint that nuclear options are being considered. George Bush said that much against Iran. When asked, do all options on the table include nuclear options? George W. Bush said all options are on the table. And after the Obama administration's nuclear posture review was published, the then Secretary of Defense said our negative security assurances that we would never use nuclear weapons first against any state that is in compliance with their Non-Proliferation Committee commitments does not apply to North Korea, underlying that all options are on the table. Donald Trump's volatility and the habit of making radical policy announcements without consultation on Twitter at 4 a.m. has produced, in my view, a hidden crisis in civil-military relations in the United States. In the middle of the Watergate Affair in 1974, when President Richard Nixon had become morose and arguably unstable, Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger reportedly told the Joint Chiefs of Staff that they should contact him immediately and not blindly follow orders if Nixon independently called for any use of military force, including nuclear weapons. Schlesinger's act was extra-constitutional, but was nonetheless, in my view, wise given the extraordinary circumstances of having an arguably unstable, volatile president. That is the kind of bizarre nuclear danger that we face today under Donald Trump. So what can be done? Well, first, I would argue that the U.S. military should, in no uncertain terms, take nuclear first strike options off the table. That will be hard. Officers are trained to follow any order if it is a constitutional order. But the Constitution says nothing about what to do if an order is arguably constitutional, but arguably crazy. And that's why you have the military today making some I think, surprising but understandable under these circumstances statements. When asked recently at a conference in Australia whether he would execute a nuclear strike against China next week if ordered to do so by President Trump, Admiral Scott Swift said yes. He should have said, that's a crazy scenario and I will not even deign to make an argument about such a ridiculous scenario. But following orders, as they are trained to do, he would say, I followed that kind of order. That's deeply unfortunate, because what we have, because of this reciprocal fear of surprise attack, I believe, is a very unstable situation. The ROK government, in its last white paper, talks about decapitation, even has a nice illustration of commando forces, cruise missiles, and airstrikes against Pyongyang. The United States, in its exercise statements, has talked about preemption and decapitation. And now you have, understandably, a response from Pyongyang saying that they are following a preemptive strike plan. Because, as a Ministry of Defense statement in the North put it, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of the DPRK decided to take preemptive attack as the mode of its military counteraction. To protest after being hit by a U.S. preemptive attack will be of no use. A preemptive attack is therefore the only way of disabling the U.S. sudden surprise attack on the DPRK. Now the risk here is that one side's defensive preparations will be seen by the other side as a preparation for a first strike. Would the movement of the North Korean nuclear missiles out of the caves be seen as sole as an exercise, a defensive precaution, or start of a North Korean attack? Would a joint U.S. ROK exercise of decapitation as part of a retaliation plan be seen in Pyongyang as preparation for an attack or defensive precaution? Would an ill-timed inflammatory tweet by Donald Trump be seen as signaling an imminent attack by Kim Jong-un? And in the possibility of a false warning of a missile launch? Or a U.S. or South Korean military aircraft accidentally entering North Korean airspace? Or a North Korean weapon detonating by accident during transportation? Instead of having a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion, we're living in an August 1914-like crisis at Twitter speed. Now, I'll end here just by noting that I do think we've been through this experience at least twice before. Once with the Soviet Union, when President Truman contemplated a preventive attack and decided that the consequence of a preventive attack would be a reliving of World War II. And it would be better, with all its dilemmas, to follow a policy of deterrence and containment of the Soviet Union rather than have a preventive war. We faced the same issue in the 1960s with China. The Kennedy administration thought Mao was arguably crazy, given the statements he had made about the consequences of nuclear war. And even went so far as to approach clandestinely the Soviet Union to ask whether there would be interest in a joint military attack on the PRC nuclear program. The Soviets said, "Niet." We learned to live with a nuclear Moscow. We learned to live with a nuclear Beijing. And we can learn to live with a nuclear Pyongyang. That's not a long-term solution, but it's necessary in the short term. We should, in my judgment, be practicing a deterrent policy, not a non-proliferation policy with the North. We should be trying to convince Kim Jong-un, who is surrounded by yes-men who may not inform him of this sufficiently, that any attack on South Korea and the United States will mean the immediate, swift, violent end of the Kim regime. But we also have to convince him that we're not going to do that first, that will only come in retaliation. That is the great challenge that we face, but it's one that we've been through before, and I look forward to discussions about how to do that more effectively than we are currently doing it today.
Thank you very much, Scott, and perfect timing. We turn next to Francesca Giovannini.
Thank you, Steve, and well, good morning, everyone. I really want to join my colleagues in thanking Mansoon in particular for this extraordinary invitation, for all of you being here. It's my very first time here at NEREC Heist, and I'm really honored to be here. I have to say I'm really glad to see so many young faces, because as I'll try to explain in a second, and as Scott has already done, the complexity we are facing today really requires a lot of thinking, and a lot of thinking outside of the box. So whatever you can bring to the table is very, very welcome to the debate. So this panel is about nuclear non-proliferation challenges, and I want to broaden the discussion and move away a little bit from North Korea now to think broader about issues related to proliferation and nuclear non-proliferation. And I'll try to do a couple of things. One, I'll try to qualify the so-called proliferation concerns. What exactly are we concerned about now? And then I will try somehow to present proliferation problems as relational problems. I'll try somehow to outline 3 categories of relations that I think will become particularly important to determine proliferation issues and challenges in the future. And if I have time, I have also a couple of potential ways forward, nothing really revolutionary, but if I don't get to talk about it during my presentation, maybe I'll address them during the Q&A. Now, what are the concerns today? Now, I've spent a lot of time in the past 5 years dealing with what we call the nuclear newcomers, or nuclear aspirant countries. Countries, in other words, that are really working hard to get to nuclear energy, mostly for urbanization, industrialization, and for environmental concerns. And I think what I've noticed that really struck me the most in dealing with the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Nigeria, Ghana, Vietnam, Indonesia, is that these countries are very pragmatic. They are very grounded in a development framework. These countries are pursuing nuclear options because of development needs. So when I look at these countries, I don't expect any of what we call the tipping point or the proliferation cascade. I don't expect that one of these countries, just because Saudi Arabia might one day get nuclear weapons, will eventually follow suit. I think these countries are very pragmatic and very realistic. So for me, the problem of proliferation today is not a problem of proliferation cascade. For me, the real problem of proliferation today is that we have actually lost a sense of clarity of what proliferation is. One of the questions that was discussed particularly in 2005 and 2006 is, how does a responsible nuclear power look like? The United States has urged China to act as a responsible nuclear power. We have urged Iran to act as a responsible nuclear power, but what does it actually mean, a responsible nuclear power? So proliferation has lost a sense of meaning because many communities have tried somehow to provide their own threshold of risk. I give you 3 examples that happened in very recent time. The crisis with Iran, the Russian nuclear agreement with Bangladesh, the China-Pakistan nuclear agreement, and the US-India nuclear agreement. These are 4 episodes that clearly show that every single country has a different threshold of what it means proliferation risks. And, unsurprisingly, the flourishing new scholarship out there actually deals mostly today with what we call the gray area. Gray areas that are somehow unregulated by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Think about nuclear latency or nuclear threshold, right? These areas that somehow are unregulated by treaties and are unclear whether they are proliferation problems or non-proliferation problems, like, for example, the acquisition of dual-use capabilities like enrichment or reprocessing. Now, for me, there are 3 reasons why we've lost a sense of clarity about proliferation concerns. The first one is the power has grown way more diffused. So you have more communities that think about proliferation problems today. You have the nuclear suppliers group, you have the nuclear market, you have the non-aligned movement, you have the non-nuclear weapon states, you have the nuclear weapon states. Different communities that in very siloed way think about problems of proliferation. The second main problem the loss of clarity for me is that the nuclear non-proliferation agenda, and the speech of Scott demonstrates this very clearly, is now linked very hardly with geopolitical issues. Nuclear non-proliferation is no longer an isolated issue. It has to do with environmental concern, with the globalization of high technology market, with the arms race among great powers, with climate change, with development issues. So the agenda of nuclear non-proliferation cannot be confined only to nuclear studies. It somehow has to be integrated into broader frameworks for discussion. And the final point, which somehow mirrors the other two, is that I believe the global nuclear institutions have actually now are facing a crisis of identity, and perhaps also of legitimacy. I want to mention three in particular: the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. All these institutions have become broader in nature. They've been forced somehow to encompass new things, new issues, particularly the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And by doing that, have lost, in my view, the real identity that was given to them. So the International Atomic Energy Agency now deals also with nuclear security. The Nuclear Supplier Group now is thinking whether being a member of the NPT is important, is indispensable or not to actually be admitted into the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So I think all these institutions reflect crises of clarity about proliferation problems. Now, not the entire story is doom and gloom, I have to tell you. Certainly the nuclear non-proliferation regime itself has shown an incredible amount of resilience and adaptability. If you look at how many crises we have faced, after all, we only now have 9 nuclear weapon states. You could have gone much worse. So there is no doubt that the regime is resilient. And there is no doubt the regime has adapted. Actually, after many shocks, think about the 1991, the Gulf War, the discovery of the secret WMD program of Iraq. It was actually at that point that the international community came together to develop a new instrument, which was the additional protocol. So this regime is amenable to changes. And this is why the regime has survived thus far. But I have to say, this actually does not necessarily solve the real proliferation issues we are grappling with today. And I want to just summarize what, to me, is a framework to think about proliferation concerns today. I think you have 3 relations that are actually quite important for proliferation concerns in the future. The first one is the relation between nuclear suppliers and nuclear customers. The second is the relation among countries within specific regions. And then finally, the third one is really the relation among nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. Or, different put, the relation between modernization of the nuclear arsenal and the actually push towards banning nuclear weapons once and for all. I think this is coming really to a head, and it becomes very interesting to see how this actually will play out in real terms. Now, let me just go briefly point by point. I think the relation between nuclear suppliers and nuclear customers, and I believe Mansour will give a great presentation tomorrow about the nature of nuclear and newcomers, is really fundamental. The market for nuclear energy has shifted towards Asia. This has already happened. And in fact, in 2016, a report of the World Nuclear Association talks about the corporate meltdown of the Western nuclear industry, mentioning Areva and Westinghouse. So the big customers and the big suppliers are here. But the nuclear non-proliferation rules that we are operating by still somehow reflect Western interest, Western inclinations. So Asia will probably have to be, fundamental in shaping the new rules, the new policies that will actually be somehow adopted in the future, because the market here will actually be quite fundamental in that sense. The second issue that I think would be very important in the relation between nuclear suppliers and nuclear customers is the fact that the global nuclear market is both fragmenting and consolidating at the same time. It's fragmenting because right now you have around 110 countries, these are statistics from the World Nuclear Association organization, 110 countries that somehow are able to provide specific dual-use items that are indispensable to build a nuclear power program. So they might not necessarily have nuclear capabilities themselves, but they do have industry that contribute. 110 countries, many of them are actually outside of regulatory frameworks like Nuclear Suppliers Group. At the same time, the market is consolidating around very few suppliers. And the reason is because many of the customers that we are actually dealing with right now are emerging markets. So are economies that need many services, right? Differently from before, where you had the first generation of nuclear customers that were fundamentally Western powers. Today you have a lot of emerging markets that require a full cycle services. And this means that countries, for example, like Russia or China, are able to provide a full package service thanks to this government-to-government cooperation. So nuclear energy is no longer driven by market, it's actually very much driven by government-to-government partnership and framework. And nuclear energy right now becomes part, very often, of security agreements, of much broader geopolitical agreements among countries. You see, for example, the issue between the Chinese and Pakistanis, US, India, you have Russia and Turkey. So this nuclear agreement becomes much more than just nuclear agreements. So it becomes very difficult to control and monitor because they have different components that are not necessarily only pertinent to proliferation. Finally, let me say that in all this, one of the major leaders in nuclear non-proliferation for many years has been the United States. The United States has lost market share. The US is no longer the dominant power in nuclear energy. This is not going to be anymore a US-driven market nor a US-driven nuclear non-proliferation regime. This will actually open some very interesting spaces for new actors and new players to come in with new rules and new norms. But these new norms and new rules are yet to be seen. So we are really at the inflection point in an uncertain moment, I think, for the nuclear non-proliferation regime. Let me mention then other two relations that I think are important. One, here you have one of the world experts on the regional nuclear regime, which is Etel Solingen. And I'm just going to mention this because very rarely we talk about regional problems when we talk about nuclear non-proliferation. Every single nuclear crisis becomes immediately a global crisis. But nobody actually stops and thinks, where are actually the roots of this nuclear crisis? Many of the nuclear crises in the world start at the regional level. Pakistan and India, Brazil and Argentina, Israel and Iran, or Israel and Syria. So they are rooted in regional approaches. And the regional cooperation agreements or regional organizations are actually quite indispensable instruments to prevent proliferation because they are able somehow to address many of the insecurity issues that might drive proliferation forward. But regional integration has also come to a crisis today, in part because of nationalist movements, in part because of economy, in part because of geopolitics. So regional integration right now is coming to a halt, and it might in fact impair the possibility for regional power to solve peacefully certain crises. So it might heighten somehow the risk of proliferation. Let me end just with this. There's a third relation that is still somehow in development. And this is the relation between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. You are living in a very interesting moment. And the interesting moment is this. On the one hand, you have almost all nuclear weapon states that are either expanding the nuclear program or modernizing the nuclear program. And at the same time, you have 123 countries that went to the US, the UN, and voted to ban nuclear weapons for good. So how are these two narratives coming together? What are the challenges this basically really opposite view of security generate? I think this is a relation that is still very much under the definition. We will see this certainly at play at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Review Conference. But this, I think, is one of the sources of proliferation concerns that we actually need to take a look at very clearly. I'll stop there and I'll address some more questions.
Great, thank you very much, and I appreciate sticking to time. Now to Professor Jun, you have 15 minutes.
Good morning. I present about how to strengthen our nuclear security system. If you see this title of my presentation, it may be a little bit unusual in the sense that that I found that some of the developments was hard to find agree with this title itself, because they didn't like governance. They didn't like global governance. And the global governance, the vocabulary is already in our political science and some of these international relations areas such as climate change or finance. But when I talk to these nuclear security people, they didn't like it somehow. And also, even if they are asking for some innovations, innovative ideas, but still that I present the innovative ideas, they seem to be feeling very uncomfortable. But however, I present some of my ideas about how to strengthen global nuclear security vision. Which one? My presentation is made of two parts. One is where we are, and the other one is where we go and how do we get there. The first one is about the kind of threats of nuclear terrorism that we could witness here these days. And here, at the second point, I'd like to make a note that this mass killing, what I call mass killing terrorism, was very rare during the Cold War era, but it's very much increasing dramatically during the last 10, 20 years. In old days, this terror was just making one case by taking hostages or maybe killing just one or two. But nowadays, terrorism is just not happy with them. Just they're killing as much as possible. And so when I could count that where there was, it's my own the counting that whether there was over 100 death killing terrorism case was during the 60s, 70s, 80s. There was very low numbers, but during the last 10 years it was increasing dramatically. And also we are living in a much fertile land for these terrorist groups and activities, because as you can see, there is a much more fragile, failed state of the numbers increasing. And of course, nuclear materials, more nuclear materials available in the world. Here is another just graph showing this how this death of terrorism activities are increasing dramatically during the last just 10 years. Common themes, you can see here this is the terrorist activities, including radiological terrorism and biological, the nuclear bombs. But I don't know when that happens in the real world, we can see any Jake Gyllenhaal or Ben Affleck or George Clooney could prevent them. And the way we are awakened by this the threat of this nuclear and the biological terrorism was that I was, in my cases, these two questions. What happened if this Manhattan, this terrorism activity was caused by either radiological dirty bomb or nuclear bomb? Now it's you can see there's a new buildings, it's just management. But if they are done with nuclear material, this area might be deserted, at least deserted for maybe over decades or maybe generations. And also Fukushima, this nuclear accident showed that any nuclear power plants in the world, maybe at least 450 nuclear power plants in the world, they could be targets of this terrorism and causing serious problem. Then we need to find how to answer how to fix them. Here is my own analysis of what went wrong, or maybe what is in short supply at the moment. And I would like to point to the limits of the existing state-centered approach. And when we talk about state-centered approach, the most favorite vocabulary here is international architecture. So if you read all these nuclear security summit agreements, there is a lot of comments about the nuclear security architecture, meaning that those agreements made by the agreement with the sovereign states. But however, they tend to disagree on how this soft approach could be helpful. And also, they are very much based on the sovereignty principles. So by doing that, they neglected the non-state actors. And also they are denying international and global responsibility and interventions. They want to leave everything about the nuclear security matter to the hands of the sovereign states. And also they think that this top-down government regulation will be enough. So they might pay less attention what's going to happen at the individual level or